Good morning or good afternoon or whatever time it is where you're listening or jogging or whatever. I find that I'm an accompaniment to jogging, which is interesting. Someone to talk to while you're getting your exercise. I've never been a fan of exercise. I'm used to rock climb and things like that, but exercise for its own sake never appealed to me. But I want to talk to you today about biblical literacy, but I have to be constantly reminded that some of you will be new listeners, and I have to say a bit about myself, which is always a bit of a problem. It's the last subject I want to talk about. I usually say husband of one wife of nearly 60 years, 4 natural children, one sort of adopted who's now, we picked up in after the Rwanda war, who's now a lawyer with the federal government. All our children are married and having children. In fact, we've had our first few great-grandchildren, which is rather amazing, and they're all doing well. And so far, divorce has not been an issue anywhere in our family, which is astonishing. At our wedding anniversary, 50th wedding anniversary, when I looked at the pictures, I was stunned because there were over 50 people in our garden at the farm that Saturday, and no one in that group had experienced divorce. That's a wonderful blessing, especially for the children. So a blue-collar kid who went through the university and was duly seduced first leftwards and then rightwards and then hopefully to a more balanced position, or some would say further right. You can make up your own mind. I was a physician, got bored with medicine, did a PhD in order to see my children. The PhD worked, so we took a trip to Jamaica, which was meant to be 2 years and lasted 7, and had the privilege of working with others on writing the definitive protocol for the proper treatment of severely malnourished children, 10-pound 2-year-olds. Sadly, I've yet to go into a mission hospital in Africa where it's actually being done as it should be done. But it's getting there. So much background. What I want to talk to you today is how we are suffering because of the loss of our biblical background to life. What Newbigin, again, grabbing the idea from Polanyi, calls tacit knowledge. We all have things that we know about that we don't even think about. And when we're asked to defend them, in many ways we can't, but that doesn't mean to say that they're not true. It means to say they're not susceptible to our modern techniques. Technique is dangerous when it loses its moorings with deeper things. And the tacit world that most people grew up in, certainly in Britain for 2,000 years or so, or certainly 1,500, was biblical. Older New Testaments were the background to lives. After all, the printing press didn't come along until about 500 years ago. So for the first part of that history, most people had no access to books. Not every priest had a complete Bible, for instance, or even any text. And there's no question that at times they mumbled Latin. They didn't understand themselves, but that's the way it was. But nevertheless, the story took root and gave meaning to our society. What has happened in the recent past, Jordan Peterson sort of picked up on this and realized that the biggest problem, especially for young men, was the absence of meaning. He started working on that, and of course, the moment he did start working on that, he was going to come at some point to the question of Christ, and he's certainly dealing with that now, and his wife has already joined the Catholic Church. What he will do, I don't know yet, but I've little doubt where he will end. So the way that worked in many ways is that our language was deeply imbued with Scripture. So the people who went to the Globe Theatre to listen to Shakespeare were listening to what became the King James Bible. They knew the Bible that was in use, and so they picked up the biblical allusions. The people who went could understand Shakespeare better than a modern student, which is astonishing but true, because the modern student doesn't have the background. I became aware of this to some degree many years ago, but an email I received this week, actually, which I have yet to answer, was talking about the difficulties of teaching children these days, and did I have any ideas about how to deal with the loss of biblical literacy. So this is a first attempt, if you like. But I've been thinking about it for a long while. One of the first reasons for thinking about it when I got here in 1980 to this continent. And my son became a baseball fan, so I ended up listening to it and watching it a little bit. And a baseball commentator introducing a game said this is a battle between David and Goliath, but he seemed to be under the opinion of the opinion that Goliath won the battle. That's biblical illiteracy. Shortly after that, or a little bit more than shortly perhaps, I happened to be in America at the time of George Bush's, I think it was the first inaugural. And the commentators on whichever program I happened to be listening to, I can't remember, were listening to the speech, and one said to the other, that was a reference to the Bible, wasn't it? But they weren't sure. Now, some of you will find out the biblical allusion in the first speech, but I realized, my goodness, how could they be so ignorant? It was one of those well-known things like judge not, ye be not judged, or something of that sort. Or we will not pass by on the other side. It may have been that one. But the point was that it wasn't understood. And that was a problem. Not long after that, I was sitting in church and the preacher himself misunderstood a biblical allusion. I thought, that's really interesting. The sermon was a little uninteresting to me, so I started writing out phrases that occur in English literature that are derived from the Bible. And I'd got 30 or 40 or perhaps more by the end of the sermon. I showed them to somebody who showed them to somebody else, and then I got asked about them. And they've gone around the world, which is interesting because it's a test without the answers, which is very frustrating. You can find it on my website, johnpatrick.ca. The biblical literacy, I think it's called, but you'll find it. The most famous one of all, which I've mentioned on this podcast, but I know that people come and go, so it's worth saying again, is "But if not," which was the last telegram sent from Dunkirk to London as the British were being pushed into the sea by the Nazis. It arrived in London, it was immediately understood. I'm sure the Germans didn't understand it, and it may even have been somewhat of an inhibitory influence on them. Did they have a secret weapon that they're prepared to use if we push them too hard? So it may have played a role in the British Army escaping across the Channel and living to fight another day and ultimately to be on the winning side. But some of you listening, it wouldn't mean anything to you either. But if not, so what? It needs context. And of course, the point about growing up with biblical stories is that you have context to all sorts of phrases like that. That one happens to come from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, about to be cast into the fiery furnace for refusing to worship an image. And they say to Nebuchadnezzar, "Be it known unto you, Nebuchadnezzar, our God is able to save us from the fiery furnace. But if not, we will not bend the knee." What a magnificent telegram to send under those circumstances. But even more magnificent, immediately understood. Why? Because when I went to school, and even now, but not on the same level, when I went to school for 12 years, a passage of the Bible was read every morning. That means that children at the point of total retention, memory plus, understanding just beginning, they store all that stuff. They take it in. So the background to moral decisions amongst blue-collar people in Britain up until, or at least the 1960s, was the Bible. They knew all the stories, and the stories, of course, are morally consequential stories. That determined their basic idea of right and wrong. And it led to stable societies which are now breaking down because we no longer have a story of meaning that we all share. Interestingly, the list that I prepared, there's only one that very, very few people get. I think it's only about three or four that I know of in, well over 20 years now. I don't like to think how long it's been out there. And it's I being in the way, which, when I grew up, the church that I was in was so biblically illiterate that people could say things like that. They'd go off on a to do some complex task, and they got help along the way from their brothers and sisters. And when they got back, someone asked them how they went. They said, "Oh, I being away." And they didn't need to complete the sentence or the story, but now you do. It's the response of Abraham's servant to Abraham when he found a wife for Isaac so quickly. And if you know the story, I being in the way, the Lord led me. Brilliant. That's how tacit knowledge works. Written upon the heart. Now we're only concerned with things that are stored in the mind and aren't written on the heart at all, because it's the difference between wisdom and knowledge, between something that gives meaning and purpose and something that just answers questions like Google. Google is not even honest anymore. So it's interesting, isn't it? When we talk about things that we've really taken on board, we don't say it's well stored in my mind. We say, that's on my heart, written on my heart. The phrase is there all the while. We do say, I think I know the answer to that question when it's information. But when it's wisdom, we say, well, the story I live by, and off you go. Psalm 119, which we don't usually read because it's too long, so read it slowly, but it's all about this. It's about how God's word, written on our hearts, determines how we live, even though at the end of the psalm, one of the things he'd learned, well, let me back up because I'm foreshortening, what's the word I want? I'm jumping too quickly to the end. In one of the early stanzas, the writer says, teach me your law and I will keep it. You know, it's a teenager. Show me what to do and I can do it. But at the end of the whole journey, the last stanza, he says, I have been like a wayward sheep. Please take care of me. That's wisdom. You begin with, tell me what to do, I'll do it. Our world is totally obsessed with this. The university in particular is in deep trouble because it also cut itself off from meaning. So it is determined to prove that every problem we have is a problem of ignorance and that they can fix it. Well, COVID proved that they don't fix it at all well. And it wasn't because of a failure of information. It was from a failure of character and a failure of the formation of the will. Some of the things coming out are really very, very sad about people I respected who nevertheless cancelled people because they didn't follow the narrative, which turned out to be false. And they were good people, as competent as the people who did the cancelling. And they didn't get the respect they should have got. And if we had, we wouldn't be having these late deaths that we're having now appearing in children too. There's a problem. We've lost our narrative. We've lost our way. It just occurs to me there's another interesting one on that list, which is somewhat apposite to the time. The phrase "eyeless in Gaza" is on the list. At least everybody knows where Gaza is now. But do they know where that phrase is referring to? There's two places you might know it. The first one would be in a poem by Milton, Samson Agonistes, because it's the story of Samson in 3 words. He was eyeless in Gaza, forced to work in the mill. But when the Philistines were having a celebration in their biggest meeting place, they called for the blinded Samson to be brought so they could make fun of him and have some pleasure at his expense. They'd cut his hair off at the beginning, but it had grown again. And he asked the boy who was leading him to let him feel the main supporting pillar of the meeting house or temple. And then he asked God to give him his strength back. And he pulled the whole building down and killed more Philistines in his death than he did in his life. So it's quite a story. But it could be expressed in 3 words. Even Aldous Huxley actually wrote a book called Eyeless in Gaza, which he uses to discuss how our lives go astray, and sometimes we straighten them out, but not always. So at the back of our world, there used to be a book that was worthy of being the supporting structure to life. And one of the ways that showed up is, I would call it savouring phrases. When something is said well, it has power. People remember it. We remember it. Scripture does that quite frequently. And because, for me, I grew up with the King James, when I want to feed my soul, I tend to go to the King James Version, not because it's the most accurate. It isn't. If I want accuracy and to learn what the words are, I don't go to the very modern ones. I prefer the earlier versions of the RSV, but that's just my quirk. But the phrases that are in my soul, on my heart, I got from the King James. It'll be different for different people. Anglicans dying are more likely actually to want the old Book of Common Prayer than the Bible in many cases, except for the Psalms, because they do major in the Psalms. I've no doubt that for most people over the last centuries dying in the Western world, the most likely thing they would want read at the end of their lives is the 23rd Psalm. People know it. It's comforting, the idea of being the lost sheep, but Christ is the shepherd, and he will guide you even through the valley of the shadow of death. Phrases that poetry written into them. So many of the translations now are written by a committee, and a committee never produces poetry. My test almost invariably of a new version of the Bible, I'll turn to Ecclesiastes and look to see if they've preserved Psalm 23 and whether they have preserved. I go to Ecclesiastes, I looked and saw, and behold, the race is not to the swift, nor yet the battle to the strong, but time and chance happen to every man. If you don't recognize that that's poetry, you've got a tin ear. And many translators have got tin ears when it comes to poetry. They don't hear it. That's very sad. They're translating something that is mystical ultimately as though it was a textbook. That's a failure. We see this happening in many places. Perhaps the saddest and most cynical version of it I've come across in the last few years was talking to a bioethicist, and I said, well, bioethicists have sold their soul to the devil. Basically, they just find ways to justify unethical behavior. And he said, I only teach ethics, I don't practice them. He had no respect for his own profession because, it is disconnected from ultimate judgment. It's meaningless. If you do not fear judgment after death, you don't have any ethics. You will do what you can get away with, which is what the vast majority of the elites who rule us are doing now. They don't have any fear of God. When your doctor doesn't have a fear of God and you give him the capacity to kill you, you better take someone else with you when you go into hospital with serious illness, and make sure they're on your side. When people die, money changes hands. Corruption is inevitable, and it's undoubtedly happening. There are already plenty of examples. So, not just remembering is, hopefully all families have things like this, like, for instance, in our family, but he is good, will immediately bring the Narnia stories into everybody's mind because we've read them together many times. So there are phrases that we use in the family all the while. What on earth are they teaching them in school? They're all there. Stories that everybody shares, so that short phrases bring whole stories into mind because they're written on the heart, although they're stored in the mind. It's the difference between wisdom and knowledge. University thinks everything is a problem of ignorance. The Bible teaches no, it's a problem that's mystical ultimately. It's about your nature, and it's about the nature of God and how those things fit together. Answering that question requires wisdom. We want to make the Bible fit our ideas. We do it with hymns, even great hymns like one that's sung so often. Oh gosh, I'm going to have a name block for it now, to show how far I've gone down this road. But it's all it's probably the most famous hymn about God always being there for us from Lamentations, actually. The hymn stops. If you took the next verse, great is thy faithfulness is the hymn. And it's funny how it takes seconds to arrive on occasions. And we all love the hymn. It's a very comforting hymn. But very few people have actually gone and read where it comes from in Lamentations, because the next line is basically this: it is a good thing for a young man to lie with his nose in the dust and to be lifted up by you. What a difference that would make. Just as great is thy faith, not great is thy faithful, that's the one I'm just talking about, the one I was talking about earlier with the ones in the fiery furnace. A few years ago there was a show called Praise Songs, which was just repeating end times, our God is able, our God is able. How much different it would have been if they'd put, but if not, we still will not deny him, which is what the context of our God is able. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We need to know the scriptures well if we're going to be formed in wisdom rather than knowledge. I mean, T.S. Eliot in the 1930s, very insightful writer, said, where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? He saw what was coming. And nowadays, everybody has access to information. The problem is it true or not? You can only call it knowledge when you're able to say whether it's true or not. And for vast amounts of the scientific literature, you can't really be critical of it if you can't read the methods section. So students are taught, and medical students are taught, that they are to practice modern medicine in a way that's based on science. We go back to the science. But you can't do that. You can't criticize that science if you can't read the methods section. So what they tell them is, if it's in the New England Journal or a major journal, you'll believe it. If it isn't, you don't. Well, that's not information. That's authority-based medicine, not evidence-based medicine. Evidence is only available when you really and truly understand what's going on. And what you really understand when you have the privilege of being given a new technique, for instance, which happened to me and my colleague Philip Hilton. The methodology was difficult and it was not precise, so you had to know what you were doing. Shortly after we published, one or two graduate students were set to work on it, and they got their answers very quickly, but they were clearly washing the data. Whether their answers were true, I don't know. They were only concerned to get their MSc, I'm sure. But they weren't being honest statistically. But you wouldn't pick that up unless you knew the technique inside out. And I could say that technique cannot produce that level of precision. The cheating. If you cheat, it takes at least 10 years to find out, and that then only if it's important. So most cheating actually works for getting tenure and all that sort of thing. We've seen how this is working. I mean, the Claudine Gay fiasco, she needed some publications to get, even though she was black and privileged because of that, and a woman, she became president, the first black female president of Harvard. And she plagiarized the vast majority of the papers she'd published, and she was so callous about it, or careless, both perhaps. I mean, she even plagiarized acknowledgements. I mean, how could you do that? She did. That's what happens. The Darwinian world produces this. David Stove, fortunately for us, the Australian atheist philosopher who nevertheless understood that the world was being seduced in a way that he wanted to stop it. In his lovely book, Darwinian Fairy Tales, he says, whatever you say a Darwinian world, if it was true, would not be an ethical one, because it would not be possible to be ethical, because the concept is not capable of being derived from Darwin. They didn't like his book. If you do get it, do read the introduction. I forgot who wrote it now, but it's a lovely introduction and will bring you into what is a good summer read, make you a bit more intimidating to people who have the standard view of the world and of Darwin at the moment, which fortunately is on the way out anyway. But back to how this comes up now. A couple of weeks ago, nearly 2 weeks this weekend, I was in Kamloops in BC at a Baptist church, First Baptist Church, to take part in a conference, their first conference on Christian schooling, Christian classical schooling. Well, I've been interested in education for a long while, and somebody suggested my name, and I said, yes, I'll come. I'm glad I did. It was both enjoyable and challenging and affirming. The first thing was, it was good to see children who they have protected from screens. So little boys and little girls knew which they were, and they played together, and they played apart, and they played as little boys and little girls. The US may now have a Supreme Court justice who was not willing to admit that she knew the difference between a man and a woman and could define a woman when she was in front of Congress. She ought not to have been appointed if she refused to answer a question like that. She was evading a difficult issue. You don't want Supreme Court judges who do that. I think you see so much of this now in special committees and the like, where people refuse to answer obvious questions that they could, in practice, answer. In reality, they could answer. They should be plonked immediately in prison for 24 hours to think about it. You should not be allowed to evade questions that you obviously do know the answer to in front of government officials. You could perhaps ask that it be done in camera if you could make a real case that national security or something is at stake. But they have the right to know these things. But they get away with it time and time again. It's incredible. Something should be done about it. Ordinary people don't like to see it happen. It's not fair. But that's where we're at. That's the world we're in. In post-Christian world's biggest problem is that it has no means of coming up with a rational account for a child growing up of why you ought not to do X or Y and you ought to do Z. But that rationality is only God's rationality. He is not rational. He is rationality itself. So when he speaks, it has total authority. And when we were wise, we produced constitutions that were very, very simple and easy to understand. The Ten Commandments made the Jews. Magna Carta is easy to understand. The American Constitution is not like these modern charters that we have with so many clauses and so many special interests being built into it that they're useless. The Canadians helped the South Africans establish their charter constitution, and it's doing them a great deal of harm, as it is doing to Canada as well. It doesn't have the clarity that comes when you have a simple statement. There's no explanation given for the Ten Commandments. It's simply, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. You have enough experience of me to know that I am to be trusted. And these 10 divine intolerances you must live with. Because if you don't, you will not flourish. If you do, you will flourish. That's the promise. So it was good to see these parents in a Baptist church who had become absolutely appalled by what their government in British Columbia was doing with sexuality. In the recent past, they've decreed a program called SOGI, which is basically, it wants sexual orientation and gender issues not taught as such, but throughout the curriculum. So even mathematics has to use gender-affirming examples. They want it to saturate the whole thing. This is wrong. You don't allow a small percentage of the population to determine how children should think about everything all the while. You've got to defend that at an adult level in a way that nobody can put you down. But of course, it's easy for somebody who's really worked in the area and thought about it to say, look, this gender-affirming stuff is destroying children. They won't listen to the people who spent the most time thinking about this, years and years. And the best account of it in the Atlantic, you can hardly lay your hands on. But the data's coming out. It's not going to be good, that's for sure. How bad it's going to be is only just beginning to emerge. Just because a few people decide what's politically correct doesn't make it right. So it was good to meet with these people and to talk about the ways in which, in a Christian environment, we come to our ideas of good and evil and how we express them and the ways in which they are to be done. Basically, two sets of ideas. The first being built round the family, the dining room table, and the telling of the history of the Jews, because unlike any other history, their history is morally consequential. You don't tell the children what it means. That comes later. That's why grammar precedes logic. Logic only comes when they start asking how and why. 7 or 8, and then you teach that. But they can remember everything before that, so you make sure you teach them all the history, the real stuff. The real reason for not taking the statues down is that we ought to tell the story even when bad things are done. We've all done bad things. When it comes to slavery, there isn't a culture that hasn't done it. The biggest slave keepers at the moment are black on black in the Sahel. So no judgment on them, as there's no judgment on us except that it's wrong, but we've all done it, so we have to be careful what we say. And those statues that tell us what happened that shouldn't happen are humbling and good. But we should keep them. We should keep them. Tell the story truthfully. Now, of course, some of those stories are already falling apart. I mean, you have to be competent with your equipment to determine that there are unmarked graves which didn't exist. That's the sort of thing that happens. So, starting with the Jews and the way they understood the nature of God and the nature of their obedience to him, and the way they tell their stories, he did evil, he did good. Evil and good are determined by whether or not he kept the law as a king. And it's about 8 or 9 to 1. Most of us fail most of the time, but not all the time. And it's when a good king takes over that better things can happen. We're drifting downwards at the moment, particularly with respect to sexual behaviour. Everybody actually wants their marriage to last. No child has ever enjoyed divorce, but the things we're doing, the things we're teaching, are not going to produce that outcome. And what these people wanted, they intuitively knew that what was being proposed was wrong, but they needed help in how you talk about it, how you think about it, and what questions you are to ask. And it was a great privilege to help with that. The second half, after the first one, about the nature of objective moral truth, and if it doesn't exist, we're in the deepest trouble. But there's plenty of reason for saying you believe in a no God or you believe in a God. So faith is everybody's cup of tea by definition. They can't avoid it. So you look at the outcomes. And then the next thing is the church has gone wrong. The church, when it's doing well, acts as salt in society, and salt preserves what is good and destroys what is evil. So following the 18th century in England, for instance, when Whitefield and Wesley started to preach, London was a very dangerous alcoholic place. It was said that every 6th house in London sold gin, and the advertising was drunk for 1 penny, dead drunk for 2, clean straw for 3. What a place. But when Wesley and Whitefield started preaching, amazing things happened. And we should teach them because they did happen. They're well documented. But they're not taught in school, although the impact of the revival, we like to think that it was rational. No, it's not irrational, but it's super-rational. The Clapham sect came out of the 18th century revival, and the people in that group, Shaftesbury, who stopped child labour, as a group, they undermined the power of the rich elite by who controlled everything by the Corn Laws, and they were repealed, which allowed the inventiveness that was going to take over at the end of that century and certainly into the next century. Incredible inventiveness came out of it. The reform of prisons came out of it. And of course, most importantly, the end of the slave trade, Wilberforce. And most people are not aware that it was an almost evangelical desire to stop slavery. The British spent a good percentage of their naval bill on stopping the slave trade. They didn't pay it off until the 21st century. I mean, it's set up as a separate thing, and that bill was only finally paid off in the last 100 years, less than that. That story is not told because it doesn't fit the narrative of the ignorant elite. They should be honest and tell the stories that happened. So within 6 weeks of Wesley and Whitefield beginning to preach, things happened. Whitefield in particular had an astonishing voice. Yeah. Benjamin Franklin measured it as audible at 1/4 mile. It must have been an astonishing voice. But he was refused churches by stuffy Anglicans, so he went into the fields. He was an Anglican priest himself, but the bishop wouldn't allow him to preach in church. So he did it out of doors, which he shouldn't have done, but he did it. And the first place he did it was in the Forest of Dean. Sounds like a beautiful place, actually open cast mining. And there's an account in the local newspaper of the miners coming out of their hovels to listen to this man preaching the gospel, telling them that there's a better future for them and for their children, that their souls can find peace with forgiveness. And white lines started to appear on their cheeks as the journalists, as the tears washed the soot out of their face. But 6 weeks later, Whitefield was coming back to America. And these miners asked him to have a meal with them before he left. And they asked him to lay the foundation stone of their own school. That is astonishing. And all across Britain, you can see now disused little Methodist and Baptist chapels which sprang up everywhere because people had an experience of God which was great and real, and it made a difference. And it changed the ethos. Now, that takes much longer. Naive Christians think that the moment you become converted, you become good. No, you don't. You become redeemed. You're under new management, but we are left to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling over time. And the time required is usually centuries for real public policy changes to occur, but they do occur if it's held on to for sufficient time. If you want more about where we are now, you can go back to an earlier podcast with Kirk Dunstan. I think you'll find that interesting. But I've used up a lot of time today. But I do think the hope for us lies with Christian schools that started with a good idea, and they now have to do the work of looking at the history that is there. We always need to go back to history and see what has happened before. And that's going to give us the vision to know that we're in for a long haul, for sure.